Squid Game Netflix series was rejected in Korea several times by producers of major media in 2008, until it was finally accepted by Netflix. Maybe the reason why Korea refused to show the Squid Game series is due to the real-life Squid Game happening several years ago. Today, we are going to deep dive into the historical events that some people believe that Squid Game is inspired from. The argument goes back and forth, but what cannot be ignored is the similarities between the TV series Squid Game and events that actually happened in South Korea. So let's just get into it. Squid Game, a South Korean dystopian survival TV series, was written and directed by Han Dun-yong. I apologise if my pronunciation isn't great. The series revolves around a contest where 456 players suffer from deep financial hardship, have to risk their lives to play a series of deadly children's games for the chance to win 45.6 billion won. Season 1 received international attention, becoming Netflix's most watched series, and even received 6 Primetime Emmy Awards and 1 Golden Globe. Season 2 was released December 26, 2024, and the third and final season is scheduled to be released in 2025. The show aims to create a visual representation of the contrast between rich and poor, taken to the extremes, as players sacrifice their lives in the chance to win the 45.6 billion won. Despite the show being fiction, a stir began with a number of fans striking a similarity between Squid Game and a shocking series of events that unfolded in South Korea in the 70s and the 80s. And this brings me to Brothers Home. It has been mentioned numerous times that Squid Game has not been inspired by what happened in Brothers Home. However, the similarities are a little bit uncanny. Knowing that the show had difficulties being released in South Korea due to the events that happened in real life furthers my argument that the real life Brothers Home and the fictional show of Squid Game do in fact interlink in some particular ways. The Brothers Home was a welfare facility located in Busan, South Korea. The camp was home to some of the worst human rights abuses in South Korea during the period of the 70s and the 80s, and has been nicknamed Korea's Auschwitz by various Korean media outlets. Throughout the 1950s, the Republic of Korea struggled to recover from the devastation of the Korean War. Welfare policies during this period were focused on housing vulnerable individuals who lacked appropriate supervision, particularly focusing on housing orphans, as they were seen as a stain on South Korea's national reputation. Many kids were left vulnerable after their parents died in the war, and this facility was the largest and most notorious of the 36 detention facilities designed to cleanse South Korea's streets and remove the mark that was left due to the aftermath of the war. These individuals were also viewed as symbols of poverty and disorder of the cities, and thus they were removed. The Act on the Execution of Duties by Police Officers of 1953 provided a legal basis for police forces to detain those who lacked supervision from an adequate supervisor. They were sent to police stations, hospitals, and other welfare facilities. Section 3 of the Act required officers to acquire the consent of the seized individual. Officers were required to inform family members or close associates of the detainee without delay. However, according to witness accounts, these procedures were rarely followed. In other words, police were allowed to detain those who needed protection, but in reality, children were seized from the streets against their will, and rather than act as a rehoming operation, they were kidnapped. At times, these children would be playing in the streets or travelling home and despite having family or guardians looking after them, this was often overlooked or ignored. The facility held not only homeless and disabled individuals, but also people with families and jobs who were found drunk or without proper identification at the time. And this brings me to my first similarity between the two: the kidnapping of individuals and the exploitation of the vulnerable. In Squid Game, players would agree to the games where they would be picked up in a van and knocked out with a sleeping gas. When they awoke, they were confused and alarmed that they were brought to a facility where they didn't know was situated or where they even were, and they were also unable to leave unless an overall majority vote through a democratic system was met at a later date. At Brothers Home, it was common for individuals to arrive at the facility via kidnapping and were not allowed to leave. Many of the individuals sent to Brothers Home were homeless people, orphans, and street children, often detained without due processes. They were subjected to forced labour and physical abuse for profit. In Squid Game, players are financially desperate and lured into a deadly sense of competition with promises of a large cash prize. Their vulnerability is exploited by a system that uses them as tools for entertainment and profit. And this also brings me to my second similarity: coercion and lack of choice. In Brothers Home, residents had no real choice in being detained. Once inside, they were trapped, with no possibility of leaving, and subjected to horrific treatment under the guise of rehabilitation. Squid Game, while participants initially agreed to play voluntarily, are coerced into returning through manipulation of their desperation. Once back in the game, they cannot leave without facing deadly consequences. Lee Dong-yin was sent to Brothers Home at the age of 10 and spent 7 years there. He claimed, "I was playing alone in my neighbourhood in Busan when the men snatched me, tossing me like garbage onto a freezer truck-like vehicle." At Brothers Home, Mr. Lee was number 110, and what he found there was sheer hell. Which brings us to the third similarity. Individuals who were sent to this facility were named via their designated number and wore uniforms. It was revealed by Busan-based prosecutors that inmates were provided identification numbers in matching dark blue tracksuits. This is much like what happens in Squid Game, yet the title player is also assigned to them. Han was just 8 years old when his father left him and his 10-year-old sister at a local police station, unable to care for them on his own. They were immediately transferred to Brothers Home. He was the youngest in his platoon, as the facility was operated on a military basis. Inmates were malnourished, and grapes were a nightly occurrence. Those who dared attempt to escape over the 7-meter fence would be beaten to death. "My face was covered with blood, severely swollen," he says. "I couldn't eat properly for 3 days because I was beaten so badly. But then a survival instinct kicked in, and I began to adjust." Han describes beatings with clubs, water torture, and frequent sexual abuse by the guards. From the moment you opened your eyes to the moment you fell asleep, there's abuse. If I suffer today, others will suffer tomorrow. The facility was supposed to feed and teach what the government were calling vagrants, many of them being minors, and train them for jobs. Instead, it turned out to be a house of nightmares. While there were no organised games in the recreational sense, inmates were subjected to brutal activities and labour as a form of control and punishment. Some of these ordeals included forced labour. Inmates were forced to work in gruelling conditions, manufacturing goods for profit with little to no rest. They built everything themselves, including a church, and were beaten in the name of Jesus. Inmates were reportedly made to perform degrading physical activities, which would be described as games by the facility guards. A frequent game the guards would play would be to force inmates to hold painful positions for extended periods of time, beating them when they would fail to hold this position within a time frame. Other reports mention instances where residents were pitted against one another to survive or endure harsh tasks, treated in ways that dehumanised them. And this brings in my fourth similarity. Themes of authority and corruption. Brothers' Home was operated with impunity, protected by corrupt officials who allowed the abuse to continue despite evidence of horrific conditions. And Squid Game is run by a secret organisation with powerful and wealthy bankers. There's an underlying commentary of societal corruption and the imbalance of power, which leads into the fifth similarity, expanding on authority. In Squid Game, players were required to play and succeed in games in order to survive, and in several of these games, players were pitted against each other, such as the tug-of-war game and Squid Game itself, all of which were monitored by the guards, who were ultimately in control of the games when they took place. In Brothers' Home, the guards, or abusers I should say, were in control of the games inmates faced, such as telling them which positions to hold, for what length of time, or made inmates fight against each other for their own amusement. Reports state that a total of 513 Brothers' Home inmates died between 1975 and 1986. However, it is believed that the real figure is much higher. The atrocities that took place at Brothers' Home has long been one of the best documented cases of the abuse of human rights under Korea's successive dictatorships. Over the decades, survivors have written books, major TV stations have released investigative documentaries, and there has been a multi-part series focused on the abuse and the attempts to cover up what happened in this facility. Park Young-bo, who was incarcerated at Brothers' Home between 1975 and 1980, said that the whole country is an accomplice. There's always been an overflowing amount of evidence of wrongdoing, but no one cared. No one listened to us inmates. We were treated like trash of society. Numerous news companies have asked why there has not been a new and transparent investigation as demanded by victims, and the South Korean Interior Ministry answered, "Past affairs are very complicated and need a special committee to conduct the investigation." The inmates of Brothers' Home were victims of horrific crimes, regularly beaten, raped, killed, and used for slave labour. Many were held there illegally, and unbeknown to their families, according to survivors and investigators. Which brings me to my sixth similarity, dehumanisation and brutality. In Brothers' Home, inmates were treated as subhuman, abused, tortured, and even killed. Reports indicate bodies were buried secretly, highlighting the lack of humanity in the treatment of the detainees. In Squid Game, players are reduced to numbers and forced to participate in brutal, life-or-death games for the entertainment of wealthy elites. Their deaths are treated as mere spectacles rather than tragedies. Kim Young-wan confirms these brutal details. He was once an eager young prosecutor from the Ulsan district, and the abuse at Brothers' Home stopped when it did, due to his efforts. He claims, "I went pheasant hunting one day. I saw people in shabby clothes working outside with guards watching them closely." This brings me to the seventh similarity. Both accounts have been solved or are currently being solved in the series by a detective who has decided to investigate the area and what is happening in the facility. Kim raided Brothers' Home alongside detectives, where they found thousands of inmates detained against their will. He claims it was a perfect detainment facility, not a welfare facility. locked from the inside and out. There was a hospital ward where patients clearly received no treatment during their time at this facility. Kim also states his investigation was restricted and sabotaged by his superiors from day one. In addition to this, when Kim made the arrest on the owner of Brothers Home, he was contacted by the mayor of Ulsan, telling Kim he could not arrest the man who was responsible for these atrocities. Kim states that the owner of Brothers Home, Park In-gwon, was a powerful man. He had been awarded 2 state medals for social welfare achievements and had friends in powerful places. And this may explain why Kim's efforts were sabotaged by his peers. Park did not respond to repeated requests for comment by numerous news sources, but in an autobiography that he wrote, he denied all accusations of wrongdoing. Park was eventually sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for embezzlement and minor charges after a lengthy legal battle. 2.5 years he faced. 2.5 years in prison for embezzlement and minor charges after being responsible for running a facility like this. It is clear that this facility was used for nothing more than slave labour and abuse, and this man let this happen, and yet he faced 2.5 years in prison. I can't get over that. It's just mind-blowing. This man deserves to burn in hell, along with all the guards that were responsible for treating these victims like this. Brothers Home was shut down in 1988. Han's older sister and father were both pushed onto the streets, despite the mental issues they were experiencing, and were later moved to a mental hospital where they currently now live. Han regularly visits them to bring them snacks and coffee. Their meetings are strained, the physical and mental torture they experienced taking its toll. Han lives with anger in what has happened to him and his family, living a purposeless life, not being treated like a proper human being, and he resents the government, who must accept the criticism to look properly at the events that took place. Han and fellow victims want the government to open a public investigation to acknowledge this shameful chapter in South Korean history, and to allow the victims of Brothers Home to find closure and perhaps some peace. I say that this is the bare minimum to what they're owed. Both cases reflect South Korea's grappling with darker sides of economic struggle and exploitation. Squid Game brings these issues to a global audience through entertainment, while the story of Brothers Home remains sovereign and a reminder of real human suffering. Alright, that's it for today's video, guys. It was definitely an interesting one to research about. I'd say that it's absolutely heartbreaking that the man who ran this facility got such a tiny little sentence, and the victims of Brothers Home have not received any form of closure. Whether Squid Game is related to Brothers Home or not, the argument goes back and forth constantly. Even if it's not, it's showing people that these events actually took place in real life and a lot of people suffered. And the more awareness that's raised about it, maybe something can be done about it. Who knows? I hope that the victims of Brothers Home who are still alive are getting on with their lives and have managed to find closure in their own way. I don't even know how that would be possible after experiencing such traumatic events, but I hope that they're doing alright. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!